Hello and welcome to the Six Cons podcast. I'm really excited today to introduce you to Kiran. Hello, Kiran. How are you?
Hi, Lisa. I am delightful and wonderful to be here. So thanks so much for having me.
Pleasure. And we are going to dive straight in and we're going to be talking about nailing your pitch. So we're going to help listeners with that, sharing some top tips today. But I want to start by asking you, is there a pitch that you've seen that really impressed you, that really stood out, and what made it stand out to you?
Yeah, there are a number that come to mind, and I would say they follow this really fundamental principle for not only just great pitches, but great communication. And it's the expectation gap, where what you're expecting and what is given, there is a really big gap. And as we know, and you've probably sat through pitches before, like what are you normally expecting? Someone to either get on stage or if it's a one-on-one conversation, introduce who they are, what the company is, what they do, and you see it. And our brain is a pattern recognition and story generating machine. And so when you can break that prediction, you can break that forecasting, then ultimately you're going to grab people's attention and you're going to stand out. So the one that comes to mind, honestly, I remember sitting in a room of about 100 people and it was a startup pitch. And it was literally the first slide, didn't even introduce themselves and literally went straight in and said, here's why you shouldn't invest. And it was the classic. It was like literally, here are all the reasons why you should not invest in us. These are all the bad reasons. And ultimately, it was the classic expectation gap. There was a huge gap. There was a lot of novelty. And so you could see everyone's eyes glued to the stage. And it was definitely one that stood out to me.
Love that expectation gap. Do the unpredictable, shock, the shock tactic. That reminded me of a book that I really like by Dan Heath. I don't know if you've heard of him, the US, and he talks about creating peak moments. You have to
Mm,
design those. And that's like those peak moments. Yeah, I love that. So, in terms of structuring a pitch to be clear, compelling, and memorable, what would be your advice around that in terms of structure?
yeah. So I think the first guiding principle to then, because I do have a specific structure that I've gone through across time, but I sort of feel like it's guided by this one foundational principle that we can sometimes take for granted, which is that attention in reality is not given. It must be earned. And you don't have the right to have anyone's attention. You have to really clearly earn it. And there was a book I read recently called 4,000 Weeks by Oliver Berkman. Phenomenal book. Got no affiliation, I promise you. So I'm just plugging it because I
Yeah.
can. But has a really great quote in there and basically speaks to the point of your experience of being alive consists of nothing other than the sum of which you pay attention to. And so when you let that land, you realize that you are taking something precious from someone else. So you better do a really good job of doing so because it's really important, right? You're taking away a quantum of life. And so when I use that as the frame, when you structure a great pitch, conversation, or whatever it is for me, it's got to start with the problem space, which is like, how is this actually relevant to the person that I'm speaking to? What does that actually look like? And Albert Einstein's got a great quote where he says, if I've got 60 minutes to solve a problem, I'll spend 55 minutes defining it and 5 minutes on the solution. And it is the classic preparation prior to a pitch where it's like, what's the problem I'm trying to solve here? What's the consequence of the problem that this person might have? What are the emotions that they might actually be feeling right now? And that ideal future end state that I want to take them to, what does that look like? And it's almost that form of like emotional reverse engineering, which is like, what's the emotion I'm trying to create in this conversation, in this presentation, in this pitch? And then ultimately, how do I do that? And so as a first step, it would always start with that problem space and making it very clear of how is this actually relevant to the person. And as you know, Lisa, when you're speaking to the wrong person, it doesn't matter really what you say. Your pitch is going to fall flat because it's just not relevant to them. So that would be my first point, which is really understanding the problem statement that you're looking at and the consequence, more specifically, the emotional consequences of that, if that resonates.
I love how you've picked up on the emotional aspect of it. Do you feel that people generally spend enough time on that aspect, like the emotional connection piece?
It's a great question because I would love to think unconsciously we do. Because the question is like, why are we always so scared sometimes of doing a pitch? We're scared of people's emotional reactions. So we spend a lot of times in our heads worrying about the emotional consequence of it. So it would make sense that you would spend time worrying about the emotions you're trying to create in the pitch that you're having. And so probably not is the answer, because we can get very logical, we can get very driven by the content, but we also have to remember the context behind the content, right? You can give anything you want, fancy words, lovely stuff, but if it's not put in the language that the person you're speaking to is going to resonate with, then it doesn't really matter. And so one of the main arms you have is the language that you use. Like I was taught this when I was first learning how to sell, and it was always like when you're doing consultative selling, you want to make sure you listen for those hot button words. They're those emotional words that are repeated 3 to 4 times in a conversation, and you want to use that language back at the person you're speaking to, because people like those that are similar, and similarity breeds familiarity and vice versa. And so to your point, that emotional connection is so important, and you can reverse engineer it, but you just need to be very intentional and tactical about it.
One other little question that's come up for me is something that a lot of my clients or people, especially working in finance, struggle with, where they have to report on numbers and a lot of numbers, and they're just not getting the engagement. What would you say to those that they're required to present lots of numbers, but they're not necessarily getting the outcomes or the buying that they're looking for?
Sort of when you zoom out on it and you ask, what's the purpose of a number? And for me, it's to make a story concrete. It's to make a story based and grounded in reality. And so, as we know, narrative bias is a thing. We're so influenced by stories. I think Yuval Noah Harari has read in *Sapiens*, and the core thread of why humans have been able to survive and be the apex predator is our ability to tell stories to really bring people together. And so if someone came to me and said, how do I make sure that I am influencing using numbers? And the way that I like to coin influence is you're just trying to move people from point A to point B. Sometimes when we use the word persuasion, we can feel a little bit dirty, like I'm trying to manipulate and be Machiavellian and move someone against their own will. But if you're moving someone from point A to point B, again, it's what is the problem behind the number? So what is actually the problem that sits behind it, and what's the emotion that sits behind that number? If we say, for example, that let's just make up something and say 90% of people don't use emotion or think about emotion when they're about to pitch. The question is, you'd ask yourself, look, have you ever had a situation where you're saying all these brilliant numbers, everything's coming across, but they're just landing flat? People are looking at you, these are great numbers, but it doesn't really resonate with me. Well, clearly, we've missed the point of what's the problem. Because it's, look, have you ever had that situation where you've been sitting there and it's, look, there's no emotional connection, you're not feeling it, and you're giving numbers? Well, it's because behind the number, there's not a story. And so I like to always think story number, where story is almost the context and then the number is grounding that. And that's the whole notion that people make decisions emotionally and then they rationalize it after the fact. So that's how I would try and position those that need to leverage numbers and need to be, let's call it, influential in that way.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Thank you. That's a nice structure to remember. Quite a simple one. Story number, story number. I'm just going to take you back to something you said about hot button words. The hot button words, you're saying you're listening for those words that come up regularly and then using that word back to the other person. Also, I'm assuming to make them feel that you're really attentively listening and you're present with them. I'm just wondering how you would balance repeating those words enough so that it landed with the other person and gave them some impact and felt that you were listening to them. But on the other side, not repeating it too much so that it sounds inauthentic or insincere.
Spot on. You don't want to be a robot, right? Like every time something feels like it's scripted and it's, oh, I found these 3 words and I'm going to repeat them every second or third sentence, it can, to your point, become incredibly inauthentic. And as a general rule of thumb, people can smell a rat. Like people can normally feel when someone's not being authentically themselves. And so the balancing act is really understanding, first and foremost, what's the outcome you're trying to drive, which is, are you actually trying to get someone to buy something from you? Or are you simply just trying to move them? As coaches and speakers, we're constantly trying to move people from one behavior to another. So in reality, we're selling, but we're just doing it in a slightly different manner. And so I wouldn't overuse it to the point that it's becoming very clear, but I would say that the premise comes from seek to understand before seeking to be understood. And I think Satya Nadella, Microsoft CEO, puts it incredibly well. And he says, don't be a know-it-all, be a learn-it-all. And in these situations, when you are having conversations with people and there might be movement that's required, it is those first, second, third order questions that when you balance that with the language that you hear and you use it back at them through your statements and your questions is going to feel a lot more authentic because it's being led by curiosity rather than like some tactical maneuvering and positioning to get them into a place that you want them to go.
Yeah, love that. And I love the way that you've brought up curiosity. That is one of my 6 Cs. I love that. So, other than that balance, that fine line between being sincere but also driving an outcome, but being present all at the same time, what are some of the common mistakes that you've
Mm.
observed when people are pitching, and how can they kind of avoid those?
So I am obsessed with this tactic and question. So I have evangelized it for a while and it's a pre-mortem. So doing pre-mortems. And I love it with communication as well, which is, and I think Charlie Munger has this quote, and I might be paraphrasing it. So if anyone's listening, please correct me. But I think he says something like, it's much easier to avoid stupidity than it is to seek brilliance. And I've really taken that to heart with communication. Like we can sometimes look at what we need to seek rather than what we need to avoid. And if we just avoid them, then we seek it anyway. And so the pre-mortem question I'd encourage people to ask is, say I got to the end of this pitch. I got to the end of this communication and it was just an abject failure. It sucked. It didn't go well. What would be the reasons for that? What would that look like? And if we can list those reasons and then come up with, let's call it those risk mitigation strategies or tactics, then we're going to obviously avoid, not going to call it stupidity, but avoid failure and of course seek brilliance in the process. And so if I apply like a Pareto lens to pitches specifically, the classic 80-20, a few things are important, most are not. First one controlling, I think, would be pitching to the wrong person. So this is before you've even done it. Like, are you actually speaking to the right person? And I know that is so cliche and it's so trite, but it's true. Like, you're going to feel terrible if you're in a situation and someone's just not resonating with it. And it's like, well, okay, have I targeted the right person? I think the second part of what you want to avoid in a pitch is making it all about you. It's the classic Dale Carnegie thing of don't be interesting, be interested. And even if you're pitching to a large group of people, the preparation that's required is to have conversations with these people, these like ideal customers or your ideal target personas, and really understand what makes them tick and move. And if you can speak in their language, you can make it about them, then of course you're going to avoid the common mistake, which is to make yourself seem incredibly impressive or your company impressive, when in reality, if you can solve a problem well and be useful, that's what's probably going to make the biggest jump. And the final one that comes to mind in terms of mistake, when people are doing a pitch, we all, and you've probably seen this when you've coached people, Lisa, like people get quite scared of the ask at the end, asking for the next step or asking for the close or whatever it might be. And the premise or tool I'd give is leveraging micro commitments. So if you've got a really big commitment at the end, which is, would you like to buy this or would you like to join my program? That's a big ask. But if you've gotten micro commitments along the way, which is simply asking a question where someone would say, yes, that resonates. Yes, I'm really leaning in. Then maybe you get 2, 3, 4 of those yeses. The final yes becomes a little bit easier. The analogy I've got for you, it's like when you're doing a presentation and then you ask a question like, what's the meaning of life? Like someone's sitting there being like, I don't know. I haven't really thought about it much. I'm on the spot. But you would ask them, what's your name? Okay, what have you done today? You'd ask these little questions to then ultimately ask a final question that is the big one. And so don't be the person that's pushing a rock up a hill by the end. Be the person that's rolling a rock down a hill by getting those micro commitments.
Love that. Yeah. Micro commitments, getting people to say yes and getting comfortable and positive and empowered along the way. Yeah. I love that. It's like the snowball effect, I imagine, as well.
Spot on.
Yeah. How can you use body language, the non-verbal? So I see a lot of people concentrating on the slides and what they're going to say and scripting it, but very little attention on how they're showing up in their bodies, in their facial expressions, in their energy, their persona, the aura, all of that stuff. So, how can we use body language and tone of voice to enhance our pitches?
And that's the key, right? Which is you're combining non-verbal and verbal communication. And we can, as you mentioned, sometimes forget that, yes, the message is important, but also the messenger is going to be pretty critical here. And so in terms of the analogy that has always worked for me in my end, and this is just for me, with body language and then looking at, say, tone, Tone is the color of your pitch. It actually imbues emotion behind the words that you're saying. And so I could say, this is a great conversation, Lisa. I've had a great time. Those are the same words. But I might say, Lisa, this has been a fantastic conversation. I've really enjoyed it. And clearly there's a little bit more color in that second than there was in the first. I promise you the second one was genuine. The first one, though, when you look at body language, for me, is the thing that adds gravity to what you say. And so if I was going to give like something tactical to do with body language, when you look at some of the best communicators in the world, and I recommend anyone watches magicians, like magicians are just unbelievable, and stand-up comedians, because they're so deliberate and intentional with everything that they do because they've practiced it so much. But there's this term I really like, which is called body syncing. And when you look at the best, let's call it most impactful speakers, they sync their body language and their gestures to what they're saying. So they'll move this way and then they'll move that way, but they'll do it in a way that almost looks like popping and locking when you dance, and like you're dancing to the beat and you move at the same time. They're doing that with their voice and their body language. And when you do that, it has a lot bigger impact on the message that you're actually trying to say. And so to reverse engineer that in terms of how you would prepare, this is classic deliberate practice, but you'd film yourself pitching, you'd record yourself doing it, and just watch for those moments where there is a very clear gap between the body language that you're showing and what you're actually trying to say. So that would be for the body language piece. For the tone piece, I think it really comes down to what we spoke about earlier, which is what's the emotion you're trying to create? And if you have a target emotion, let's just say you're trying to be inspirational, or let's say you're trying to solve frustration, then maybe your tone will then embody that. Look, I know how hard this can be. It's so difficult when you've got all these different things on your plate. They're spinning round and round, and you're sitting there being like, I'm so overwhelmed. You wouldn't say that being like, look, I know you're so overwhelmed. This is so tough. It's so difficult. I know. Like, it's not going to match, again, the tone to what you're trying to say. So that's how I'd probably try and think about body language and tone. Body language is the gravity to your voice, and tone is the emotion and the color.
Love it. Very nice. I love magicians, by the way. It just reminded me of a
So
magician
good.
I saw, just very spontaneous magician that showed up at Changi Airport. And I was amazed. You're right. The way that the one-liners and the way they've obviously put the prep work in to make it so seamless. It's incredible.
It really is. They're unreal.
The thing that I've actually just spoken about with another guest of mine, and she specializes in somatics and embodied communication. The thing that we talked about was that over polished. Sometimes if you're too polished, it doesn't come across as genuine. So while I'm hearing you say, film yourself, do that deliberate practice, rehearse, a magician, the way they show up, and someone that's pitching and trying to emotionally connect, is that the same? Because I've seen some magicians and they're a bit too polished, almost like a bit cliche.
Yeah. And you're like, are you actually being yourself, or are you putting on a show?
Is there a human in there somewhere? You know what I mean? So it's like, how do you find that balance? I suppose my question is.
No, the balancing act is incredibly hard, to your point. And you're probably by this point thinking, Kiran, where are all these quotes coming from? For some reason, I just think in quotes. So sorry, not sorry.
I'm amazed. I am absolutely amazed and impressed. I couldn't hold all of that in my brain, quite frankly.
I have too much spare time, Lisa. I just sit there reading quotes every single day. So that's a problem with me. The Kevin Kelly, he's a futurist. This quote is just hits it to what you're saying. And he says, don't be the best, be the only. And I think to that point of not trying to be necessarily the best speaker, but understanding your ikigai, your unique selling proposition, understanding who you are and putting that on stage is incredibly important. And I think that's, honestly, I don't really have a great answer for this one. Understanding the difference between what is not authentically you and what is good, which is when you're trying to help people communicate better, there's clearly got to be a baseline level of confidence, a baseline level of energy. You've got to use certain tactics. But to your point, there's got to be alignment between who you are and who you want to present yourself as. And the moment that there is dissonance between that, to your point, authenticity really reeks. I come back to probably one of the really key mental models for trust that I've come across, which is the trust triangle by Francis Fry and Anne Morris. And it basically says you've got those three core pillars of trust, which is empathy, logic, and authenticity. And that authenticity component, ideally we have all three, but we've all got an anchor, the thing under pressure that we rely on, and we've all got a wobble, the thing that under pressure tends to go. But ultimately, authenticity is, am I experiencing the real you? And it is a constant battle for anyone who's trying to communicate. But I would say, am I doing baseline? What are the core levers I can press and pull down on to be a great communicator or pitch really well? And then marry that top down with, is this how I actually want to present myself? And if you can do that, align those stories together, then again, you're going to become across a much more authentic human when you're presenting. So I think your point's really true.
Yeah. Thank you. And I love the trust triangle. I saw that TED talk a few years ago and was just like, oh my God, this is amazing. So I really recommend that to listeners. Okay, so you've already given us lots of nuggets, pearls of wisdom, lots of quotes. I've never met someone that has so many quotes up their sleeves. I love a quote, but I can never remember them. What three techniques can you share that can help us stay confident, but also adaptable and a bit agile, especially when we're pitching under pressure, when there's a lot at stake?
I feel like in this one, we always talk a lot about preparation, but Louis Pasteur, who was a French chemist, and he says this a lot, which is an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And I think it speaks to the power of preparation increasing your surface area for serendipity to strike. And what that means is when you are not prepared to a point where you're stiff, but when you know what you're going to say really well, that is the thing that fuels adaptability. I feel like there's this common misconception that people feel like those that are on the fly are constantly on the fly. And comedians are a great example of that. They're able to be on the fly because they just know their stuff so well. Like literally back of their hand, they can tell you what they're going to do, when they're going to do it, and how they're going to do it. So if I use that train of logic to give like a clear technique, I think the first one is inspired by Anders Ericsson, who is a performance psychologist. And he says deliberate practice. He coined the term deliberate practice. Practice is not just practice, it's deliberate practice. So it would be taking your pitch, using that pre-mortem we spoke about, where are the things that could actually go wrong, having those risk mitigation strategies built into your pitch, and then practicing it, and then looking back at it to then see where are the opportunities for that more spontaneity. How can I make the audience feel like this is a spontaneous moment, but it's been really pre-planned? And again, that's, I think, that key lever of the preparation helping you be a little bit more flexible. I think number two is we underestimate the power of silence and the intentional pause. And if I put my hand up, my big issue with communication always is, as you can tell, I speak quite fast. And so how to slow down, but be okay with the pause. And the way that I try and coin pauses is like in three different ones. A 2-second pause helps people like settle. A 4-second pause helps people think about what you're saying. And an 8 to 10-second pause helps people reflect on their own lives. And so understanding that a pause is not only a great way for you to catch your breath and get your thoughts together, but your job in a pitch is to either cross the finishing line at the same time or let the other person cross first. It's not about you racing forward, getting all your words out and then being done. And so the silence, that intentional pause becomes really, really important. And the final, let's call it technique, is this probably works better for one-on-one interactions, but you can definitely do it in a one-to-many pitch. And it's retargeting questions. So in a one-on-one situation, if you feel like you've been speaking a lot and you feel as if you need to be a little bit more adaptable, you might just ask, look, I know I've been speaking a lot, just to get a little bit of feedback from you. What's resonated so far? What stood out to you? And you sit there with a pause, let them speak, and it gives you some time then to catch up and then move forward. Or, of course, you can do that when you're doing a pitch. You might do something completely different. I've seen this before where someone says, look, I presented all this. Here's the problem. Here's the solution. I'd love you to turn to the person next to you and talk about exactly what we've spoken about right now for 30 seconds. Never seen in a pitch before. So interesting. And it was a great way to get people back and engaged moving forward. So always think about that notion of retargeting. Like you have agency, you have control in the pitch and communication to push people away from baseline and bring people back to baseline. And if you can do that, then you can obviously be a little bit more flexible and adaptable in your pitches.
Lovely. Great 3 tips. So number 1, deliberate practice. Number 2, silence and intentional pausing. I love the way you broke that down for people, especially those that find it difficult with the silence. So the 2 seconds, 4 seconds, 8 to 10 seconds for different situations for reflection. And then the last thing, retargeting questions. Nice. Thank you. Last question, Kiran, that I ask every guest on the Six Comms podcast. Six
Please.
Comms is founded on the 6 C's of effective communication. And just to remind everyone, the first three are connection, curiosity, and compassion, clarity, customization, and consistency. Which one of those is resonating most with you now and why? And perhaps you could connect your answer to the topic we've been talking about today.
So it would be so silly of me not to end with a quote. So I might as well just keep it going and running like that absolute idiot that I am. But curiosity is definitely the one that stands out to me. And there's a Harvard business professor called Clayton Christensen. And I honestly think this is in my top 5 quotes of all time. I keep coming back to it. But he says, without a good question, an answer has no place to live. And when we think about questions being those real core levers, you start to realize that like questions can exist without answers, but answers can't exist without questions. And so adopting curiosity in a pitch means not assuming and having, let's call it the humility to know that you might not know everything about this situation. You might not know everything about the person you're about to speak to, but you can always ask a question. You can always ask, okay, what do I need to know about this person? What might I need to prepare accordingly? Where might this go wrong? And if you do that, it's not falling into analysis paralysis and overthinking, but it's simply being very intentional with the questions you ask, then the answers that you get, and then how you perform your pitch moving forward. And it feels like curiosity is that core lever that everyone can press down upon because it's such an innate human quality.
I love that. Totally agree with that. Thank you for ending it with such a great quote. And you should publish a book with all your favorite quotes in. Is my thought on that.
I appreciate that.
I love that. Thank you so much for joining me. It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks so much, Lisa. I really appreciate it.